Hi, everyone. We're going to get started in about a minute or two, just to give everyone a chance to join. Welcome, and we're happy to have you. Okay, well, welcome. We're going to go ahead and get started. My name is Jen Reynolds. I am the Associate Dean of Academic Affairs here at the University of Oregon School of Law. It's my great pleasure to welcome you to today's Oregon Law Perspectives webinar. The Oregon Law Perspectives series brings the work of our law school's faculty to our colleagues, our students, our alumni, and the broader public. Today's session is the second in our summer series, and we are thrilled. We're joined by two amazing researchers and professors to talk about using post hoc interventions to address racial and ethnic disparities in criminal sentencing. Allow me to briefly introduce them. First, we have my colleague and good friend, Erik Girvan. Erik is a professor and associate dean here at the University of Oregon School of Law. Before joining Oregon's faculty, Erik litigated over 100 complex commercial cases in various federal and state jurisdictions across the country. He has a JD from Harvard Law School and a PhD in psychology from the University of Minnesota. Erik's research investigates how stereotypes, attitudes, and other biases might impact decisions in the legal system. He empirically tests practical ways to reduce or eliminate implicit biases by working with a diverse variety of legal and other professionals. Erik today is joined by Dr. Martin Jönsson. Dr. Jönsson has a PhD in theoretical philosophy and teaches at Sweden's Lund University, where he serves as Director of Studies for the Philosophy Department. His primary research areas are the philosophy of language, epistemology, and cognitive psychology. His research interests include, this is impressive sounding, semantic compositionality, semantic holism, semantic similarity, and implicit bias. So for more on Erik and Martin, please check out their faculty websites. The plan today is for them to speak for about 45 minutes and then take questions. If you have a question, as you have one, feel free to submit it through the Q&A on the bottom of the Zoom bar. Only the panelists and I can see your questions. They can be anonymous if you choose. We're going to gather them all and attempt to get to them at the end of the presentations. And quickly, for those of you who are seeking CLE credit, you'll receive an email after the event asking for your bar number so we can submit that to the bar so you get your credit. Please join me in welcoming our panel. Erik, take it away.
So thank you everyone for coming. Our agenda for our presentation is Martin's going to give some background on what post hoc interventions are, and then I'm going to talk about a thought experiment applying them to ethnic disparities in criminal sentencing in Oregon.
Right, so I'll get started. Can everyone see the screen currently, or do I need to reshare? So, there. So first of all, thanks for inviting us for the Oregon Law Perspectives webinar. We're thrilled to be here. So as Erik mentioned, I will start by introducing the notion of a post hoc intervention, and he'll go on to sort of a particular case of applying one, or a thought experiment of applying one. So what are post hoc interventions? They're novel methods to mitigate human prejudice using statistical methods. So these are interventions that apply after prejudice has manifested, but before some other undesirable consequence has occurred. So this is in contrast with most prejudice interventions that are preventive, or anti-hoc, if you will, that apply before prejudice has happened in order to prevent that prejudice from manifesting. This is true of both individual interventions, like increased intergroup contact or undergoing debiasing training or something like that, but attempts to make people less prejudiced. But it's also true of structural interventions that try to prevent prejudice from manifesting, like anonymization or criteria-based decision-making or something like that. So postdoc interventions are intended to be complements to existing interventions. And even though applying them in order to mitigate human prejudice is novel, they have clear affinities with existing methods for mitigating test bias, for instance, or attempts to increase algorithmic fairness. So here's just a sketch of sort of a contrast between typical interventions, preventive interventions, and postdoc interventions. So here's an prejudiced evaluator, Mike, and traditional interventions try to stop Mike from acting in a prejudiced way, while postdoc interventions try to identify sort of a gap between some sort of manifestation of prejudice, in this case, a sort of a prejudiced ranking, and some other undesirable consequence, such as, in this case, discriminatory hiring. So when can postdoc interventions be used? Well, obviously, if they apply in sort of a gap between prejudiced behavior and other undesirable effects, they can't apply if those effects are immediate. So they can't apply to violence or verbal abuse and so on, which are effects that are immediate. But it should be noted that we live in a world of where social interaction increasingly is mediated by computers. So we interact on online forums, social media, by texting, or in this case, through a Zoom presentation. And even though an effect might be perceived as instantaneous in these conditions, since they are mediated by computers, there is room for postdoc intervention to potentially apply through the computer. So whenever there is such a gap between prejudiced behavior and or manifestation of prejudice and undesirable consequences, we can at least theoretically apply a postdoc intervention. Here are a few examples of such gaps. There's a gap between a teacher producing prejudiced grades and those grades influencing where the student can go to college. There's a gap between an HR person ranking a list of job candidates and someone being hired. And there's a gap between students rating their professors and these ratings being used to assess the quality of teaching in a particular class. But saying there's a theoretical possibility to apply postdoc interventions isn't saying that we can be used meaningfully or to actually mitigate prejudice. And various factors influence whether this can be done, but I thought I'd draw your attention to two dimensions of factors that influence the prospects of a postdoc intervention mitigating prejudice. And the first dimension is the kind of behavior that you're trying to correct. So behaviors can be roughly divided along these lines in terms of categorical decisions, for instance, whether to grant parole or not, or sentencing decisions that Erik will talk about later. The kind of behavior that you're trying to correct might also be rankings. So just trying to sort of rank job candidates from the least qualified to the most qualified. Might also be a numerical interval scale assessments, which is the case in grading, for instance, where you apply numbers to people in proportion to their actual, so some skill or merit they have. The second dimension is the sort of standard of success that you have in mind, what you're trying to achieve in terms of applying the postdoc interventions. And I'll talk shortly about, I'll give an example of one postdoc intervention that aims for accurate representations. It just tries to for instance, make a ranking mirror the merits it's supposed to reflect. But the standard of success one have in mind might also be fair decisions, for instance, in sentencing. Again, something that Erik will talk about. If you're familiar with the literature on algorithmic fairness, you know that various measures of fairness are in terms of various kinds of probabilities, like false positives or false negatives, and you might like to have a equal distribution of such probabilities. Here's an overview of work currently being carried out. So there's work on a particular method called GIU, which I've done with my colleague Julia Sjödahl and Jakob Bergman, who tries to improve accurate ranking, or tries to make ranking more accurate in interval scale assessment, in hiring, for instance. There's work being done by Matilda Arvidsson and Greger Noll on asylum decisions. And this is an application to categorical decisions. And there's the application that Erik will talk about shortly on fair sentencing. Just to give you a little bit more fleshed out picture of how this is supposed to work, I'll go through the first one of these, GIU, quite briefly to give you a sense of how it's supposed to work. So GIU is a particular post hoc intervention concerned with increasing accuracy in ranking, but it depends on there being interval scale assessments in order to do this. So this a typical case is sort of a hiring situation where people are evaluated in terms of their competence using interval scale assessments. So it builds on the idea that the degree of prejudice of an evaluator can be estimated from their past assessments under certain conditions. So this is just the idea that if someone is prejudiced and this prejudice sort of bleeds into their sort of hiring decisions, there's going to be some sort of pattern across the people they've evaluated in the past, and their degree of prejudice and their kind of prejudice might be possible to estimate from the history of their evaluations. Second main idea is that prejudice acts as a form of reversible distortion of an evaluator's assessment. So this is the idea that even a prejudiced evaluator sort of does something right. There's some sort of signal in their assessment that can be undistorted. And GIU builds on that assumption. So when we worked on GIU, we tried to find conditions when GIU would work as intended statistically. And after we did that, we started finding real-world applications where those conditions were satisfied. And we tested those conditions with a computer simulation that I'll just briefly mention soon. So here's sort of a sketch of a simple case where GIU is applied. So here's a prejudiced evaluator, Mike. He has produced a particular set of evaluations for a job. He's responsible for selecting who gets that job or which people if there are multiple jobs. And we have assigned these people particular scores corresponding to how competent he believes that they are. So say that we're interested in potential sexism of Mike's part here. GIU then proceeds to go through a history of evaluations. So Mike's past evaluations for this particular kind of job that we're interested in here. And if we're interested in sexism, the people in the history of evaluations are divided into men and women, and means are calculated for these two groups. The mean difference in the history of evaluation is then compared to what would be expected from this mean had Mike not been prejudiced. So in the simplest case, we're considering we're talking about a job where men and women are equally competent, and we expect there to be no difference. GEO can apply in other situations as well, but for simplicity's sake, let's assume that this is the case. Then if we find a significant difference in between these groups, that needs some sort of explanation. And in the absence of other explanations, GEO will assume that this corresponds to a prejudice on Mike's part. GEO then proceeds to identify various corrective functions that are such that if they are applied to the history of evaluations, the found difference will be removed. So this is what so if a corrective function is applied to the history of evaluation individually, then that the found difference will disappear. Several corrective functions might be able to do this in different ways. And GEO then takes this set of corrective functions and applies them to the target evaluations, the ones we're currently interested in, to see to what extent they converge on a particular update. So the functions are applied to the scores that Mike assigned, Al, Bob, and Cyan, and we then compare the updated scores with each other to see if there's any convergence between the corrective functions. In this case, say that there are only two corrective functions. Both give Cyan a higher score than Bob, and GEO then suggests that Cyan should be ranked higher than Bob. There are various ways in which a post-hoc intervention can be implemented, differing in, for instance, the degree of paternalism. You can think of one kind of application is just sort of an override. So Mike's scores are fed into GEO, and then it just sort of spits out whatever is what it thinks should be the case. A less paternalistic application would just be a sort of a decision support system. So it sort of feeds back information to Mike concerning his past evaluations and gives him recommendations for how to update this particular case. That is briefly how GEO is supposed to work. In order to test whether it actually works as intended, we simulated 5,000 evaluators in the grip of various kinds of biases, which had 1 out of 5 degrees of fluctuation, where a degree of fluctuation is just how much the degree of prejudice of an evaluator changes between evaluations. So a high degree of fluctuation just means that the evaluator is very prejudiced in one case and less so in another. And if we're using the sort of conservative method that I just described, we can see that if there's no fluctuation, GEO will almost invariably lead to improvement when it does anything. And the degree of improvement goes down as the degree of fluctuation improves. And not reported here is the fact also that it's not only that the proportion of improvements decrease, it's also the size of improvement that decreases when fluctuation increases. So it's really something that works best when fluctuation is fairly small. Here are the set of conditions that I mentioned. Just briefly, we need interval scale values. We need a history of evaluation of a certain size, so it won't work in all situations. We need mean values for the relevant population or whatever is being evaluated, or we need reason to think that they're the same. GEO needs to classify people in the same way as the evaluator. So if GEO classifies people into men and women in a different way than the evaluator does, then obviously we can't use GEO to make improvements. Fluctuations should be small compared to the size of corresponding prejudice. the evaluator's prejudice should operate in an approximately linear way. This is likely too strong. Possibly strict monotonicity is sufficient. And finally, the evaluator's prejudice should operate on discrete groups. So in this case, men and women. Likely it could be changed to sort of apply to degree of femininity instead, or something along those lines. But these were the conditions that we know work, even though weaker sets might also work. Having said that, they're empirically valid, of course, says nothing about sort of how widespread they are, or whether or not GEO will work in a particular case. But it does tell us that we can be as certain that GEO does lead to improvements as we are that they are satisfied in any particular case. So current work that we're carrying out is applying testing applications of this in the context of the Swedish Research Council, the Swedish Employment Agency, and also on data from Danish elementary schools. And me and Erik are together with a number of other people applying for a large-scale research grant. And if any one of you are interested in this kind of work, we are looking for various competences from various walks of academia. So do let us know. So I think this is what I think gives a sort of introduction to the area. If you'd like to read more, I can share the presentation in the chat. Here are some references. So over to you, Erik.
Thank you, Martin, for the background. I'm going to share my screen here. All the pieces set up. Great. So can folks see that all right? Good. So picking up where Martin outlined the general approach of post hoc interventions, the idea of my piece was to take them and see how well those underlying assumptions about the conditions under which post hoc interventions might be used generally would apply to something like correcting for racial and ethnic disparities in criminal sentencing. I wanted to do this empirically as kind of a validation study. So what I did was take a sample of outcomes from criminal justice cases in Oregon from 2004 to 2018. Because of the way that post hoc interventions work, we basically had to rewind the clock a little bit, because the idea is to use past information to develop a correction for future cases or future decisions. So in doing so, I basically, let's go back here, effectively pretended it was, say, 2015. So you could rewind back there. So took the cases from 2004 to 2014 and assumed that those were the cases that were in existence at the time we were trying this post hoc intervention. It turned out in this, from this sample, the past decisions involved 168,000, a little over 168,000 unique sentenced offenses. So effectively, this meant that the most serious sentence for which someone was sentenced for, if they were sentenced concurrently, concurrently, to serve the sentence concurrently, and every unique one if they were sentenced consecutively. So you can think about these sentence offenses as things that people served unique jail or prison time for, or probation time for. In terms of the outcome, about 46,000 of those were sentenced to prison, and the remainder were sentenced to local control, either jail or probation or some combination of them. The future decisions then were anything after 2015 and later. So you can see the descriptive information there is about 54,000 of them separated into prison or local control. So if we think through the steps that we would need for a post hoc intervention, the first one is determining whether or not there is an unexplained disparity that might be attributable to bias or prejudice. Here, the outcome that we're looking at is whether somebody gets sentenced to prison versus local control. Of course, the idea for this, if we're thinking about what might be unexplained or attributable to bias or prejudice, the first thing we should do is figure out what should affect these outcomes. And under Oregon law, we would have their criminal record or their history of crime and offense severity, which play a role into the sentencing guidelines in Oregon. along with a few other statutory factors. And so we could look first to see whether those explain the outcome. And as we would hope, they did. This is a pseudo R-squared, but essentially for those of you who aren't as statistically familiar, basically says 95% of the overall variation in these decisions was explained by the factors that should matter. So that's great. The system should work. It should overwhelmingly, these factors should overwhelmingly lead to the kinds of decisions that we have. That's the point of sentencing guidelines. So once we've taken those into account, then we added in demographic factors. In particular, here we were looking at race and ethnicity, or the combination of race and ethnicity that was whether individuals were white or Hispanic. And there's some nuance here about how this works, because the way that people were identified in a lot of the records in the legal system as in terms of their race, like white, or ethnicity, like Hispanic, had to do with third-party identification. So for example, a law enforcement officer arrested them and they're in custody, that gets noted by the people. The race or ethnicity during this period got basically largely noted by people in the legal system. So it's not what they would self-report as their race or ethnicity, it's what somebody would identify them as. And those might differ. And that was important for the study for the following reason, because we know about the operation of stereotypes. For them to impact people's decisions, those decision makers have to categorize the target of the decision as a member of the stereotype group. The idea being, if somebody doesn't recognize somebody as Hispanic, then stereotypes around Hispanic people will not be applied to them. That's kind of makes sense logically. One area where that's used a lot in work, law enforcement related work, is something called the veil of darkness approach for racial profiling. The idea to assess for racial profiling, the idea is that there are certain times of the year where it's easier to see drivers during the same portion of the day as where it's difficult to see drivers, because in the wintertime it's dark at that time, and in the summertime it's light at that time. So we can take, this is a graph from Minneapolis. Each of these dots is a traffic stop in Minneapolis. And you can see that this period in the evening is basically the period where it's the evening commute, and it happens to be dark in December during that time. So it's hard to see the race or ethnicity of the driver, but it's light during the summer during the exact same period, right? Exact same commute. And so one way you could do is kind of compare using the logic that if the proportion of stops related to racial ethnic minorities during that period differ between when it's dark and when it's light, that might be indicative of the operation of stereotypes. So in this particular case, you can see that when that evening commute was dark, this was the proportion of Black drivers who were stopped. Whereas in the summertime, when that same period of time was light, it's the dashed line. Basically, this particular study, about over 65,000 stops, I think, in Minneapolis, found that there was about a 10% difference, suggesting that when officers could see the race and ethnicity of the driver, they were more likely to be stopped. So it's kind of applying the same logic here, but the idea is related to ethnic misidentification. So it's common for people are fairly accurate, I guess you'd say, self-identified race and third-party identified race are pretty similar for white, pretty similar for Asian, pretty similar for Black or African-American, but tend to differ pretty substantially for identification of Hispanic and for people who are Native American. And so this study essentially used that difference to kind of provide further evidence that stereotyping might be at play by comparing estimates of self-identified ethnicity to the third-party identified ethnicity in the legal records. And specifically what we can see in this is that you have the original record of ethnicity. These are originally people were identified as white, non-Hispanic, about 185,000 of them. And then here we have people that's broken down into for Hispanic of any race of people who would they be thought of to be self-identified by those, between those who were accurately identified as Hispanic, which would be over here. They were identified as Hispanic and they would self-identify as Hispanic. And those who would self-identify as Hispanic, but who were identified by the legal system as white. So the idea would be looking at essentially comparing these groups to the treatment of white individuals. with the idea being that if it's third-party identification, if it's the perception of being Hispanic, not self-identifying Hispanic, that matters, then we would see differences between this group and the white people who are white in sentencing, but not this group. So if we go back to this table that I showed you earlier, effectively then we have people who we thought were believed to self-identify as white, who were identified in the criminal justice records as white, so accurately. And that we use them as the reference category. We had people who we were estimated to self-identify as Hispanic, but who were identified in legal records inaccurately as white. And then the people who identified as Hispanic and who are identified in the legal records as Hispanic. So comparing those, the idea being to the extent stereotyping is an operation, we would expect that these two that are in green here would be very similar, and the one that's in red would differ. And that's effectively what we found in our past data. So this right here is an odds ratio of 0.97, which is basically 1, effectively meaning the people who were identified in the legal records as white, whether or not they identified as Hispanic themselves, were treated effectively the same for sentencing. Whereas the people who were identified in legal records as Hispanic were about twice as likely to get sentenced to prison as opposed to local control, even after accounting for all of those legally relevant factors. We can see in here that this is, the model explains pretty much all of the decision making. So that would be our estimate. Then our first step here is to figure out whether past decisions indicate some unexplained difference that might be attributable to bias, stereotyping, or prejudice. Step 2 is to identify a correction based on that information. In this case, the correction is this beta weight here, which is something that's produced by the statistical model. I'll just emphasize it. Effectively, that is the assessment in terms of log odds, because that's how a logistic regression model works. Essentially the log odds that explains the difference between this Hispanic group and the white group. So we could use that as a correction. How does it work? So this is actually the way that the statistical model looks at it, is here is the x-axis here is the predicted probability of prison as opposed to local control. And effectively what you see is that when this model, the prediction crosses the 0 point here, the way it is in terms of the log odds, that's effectively the point at which the model now predicts the person is likely to go to jail, go to prison, whereas below here, they're likely to go to local control. Based on the past information. So in this way, you can actually see the disparity, what's happening in terms of the model, because the blue line that's at the bottom there crosses this 0 point lower in the distribution, which means a larger proportion of the people are going to prison. Whereas for the other two groups, the crosses that 0 point higher, meaning a smaller proportion of those groups get sentenced to prison, accounting for all of the things in the model. So what do? The correction literally is just to subtract that beta weight from the log odds. And so it moves this line over. And so now you have these clustered much closer together in a way that effectively corrects for potential bias in decision-making. So the outcomes are more likely to be more similar. How does that look in terms of actual numbers of outcomes? So this chart essentially has at the top, these are the actual sentences to prison or jail probation for each of those groups, right? Then the predicted sentences are from an unadjusted statistical model. And so you can see that they're pretty close, not identical, but pretty close over here for the white group and this group. And then the bottom one is the ones with the post hoc intervention that corrected them. So in this case, you'd see that their correction isn't applied to the group that was self-identified and third-party identified as white, or the group that was self-identified as Hispanic, but identified third parties as white. Corrections applied to this group. And so you see that these numbers between here and here are different, or to highlight it, those ones differ. And so this is the correction effectively reduces the number of people who were identified as Hispanic who would have been sentenced to prison, and of course increases those in terms of jail or probation sentences. One other thing that I'll just note for those who are seeing or looking at this, for the statistical model, underpredicts prison slightly for the people who are in the white, self-identified white and third-party identified white group, and underpredicts prison slightly compared to actual for the group that were identified as white but would self-identify as Hispanic. It actually over-predicts for the Hispanic group. So that's another indication that we'd say statistically that something is different going on for this group in the decision process than it is for the other groups. So we have that correction that we might apply. So that would be basically the way to do it. And then we can think about how that relates to our criteria for when post hoc interventions might be most useful. The first one is this idea of an interval scale rating. It turns out that, as Martin noted, whether you're sentenced to prison versus probation or jail or local control is a categorical decision. It's either one or the other, as opposed to being a number. And we talked about a few others of these that I'll go into in more detail here. And I'll just pick out a couple of them, but essentially the ones that we had. Adding this last one, which is a legal question, the cure not worse than the disease, and I'll try to get to that too. So for the first one, this interval scale rating, while the decision is categorical, I mentioned that the logistic regression model actually uses log odds to predict what it is, and that is effectively an interval scale. The real problem here comes that not because the model then is in terms of an interval, but because judges don't. So the question is, I can't tell a judge to adjust their sentence by a function of a log odds because of the model, because they won't know what to do with it. Neither would I, right? It doesn't have to do with statistical knowledge. It's more of the problem of, oh, I'm inclined, or a jury, if it were, decision makers inclined to sentence this person to prison. And I say, you need to adjust that down because they're Hispanic by a log odds of 0.7. Nobody knows what to do with that. It doesn't map cleanly on the decision. So it is a bit of a problem, particularly for the decision support version that Martin talked about. Right? If we're not going to be paternalistic, instead we're going to say, look, just be cautious about this decision, then it may be challenging for them to know what to do with that, other than just sort of a general cautionary flag. But with any precision, it would be really challenging. Mathematically, we could make the adjustment on our own, but that may raise legal and other questions around accountability and the fact then that we basically just have an algorithm making the decision, not a judge, which could be problematic for other reasons. Another factor that Martin talked about is this idea of stability, whether the bias is consistent over time. And he talked about how in the models that they did, that this affected the accuracy and the utility of post hoc interventions a fair amount. Well, we could actually look at this instead of pretending that we were doing this decision in 2015. It wasn't too hard with our data to say, well, what happens if we were doing it at 2007 or 2010 or 2013, right? And look at it. And what we can see is that the odds ratios, right, which are here, it's the easiest to understand, actually aren't consistent. The one that we used was a little over 0.2, but you see that it started off from this period, it was 0.9 to 0.24, right? So the extent of the bias is basically going up during this period, and then it's dropping after that. And so I have this one particularly highlighted because these would be the corrective coefficients. And you can see that this corrective coefficient actually isn't even in the confidence interval for the prior 2 years. And so you're kind of faced here practically looking at the data that there's enough variation that depending on how much data you're using and what time period you're using, you're going to systematically under or overcorrect. We'd know that happened, but you wouldn't know what you were doing in any given time period. Another point that was raised is that the correction has to come from the same categories as the rater. So Martin talked about if the post hoc intervention correction is based on a identification of sex that's different than the raters used, then it wouldn't work as well or might not work at all. We actually are faced with that problem here in terms of the ethnicity. And this relates to a question that comes up a lot when it comes to work on racial and ethnic disparities, and even some on sex or gender-based disparities, which is, do you use self-identified race and ethnicity, or do you use third-party identified race or ethnicity when you're doing your analysis? Because of the way stereotypes work, the results may differ based on self-identified ones when people might inaccurately identify people that way. So just as a thought experiment, if we had used self-identified race and ethnicity in the study, instead of using third-party identified race or ethnicity, we basically would have come up with an undercorrection because it would have lumped all of the Hispanic people into the comparison group, even those that had been identified by decision makers as white. And so our correction would have been around 0.5 instead of 0.7. That would be the implication. And just as a quick reminder for comparison, that the model that broke them out separately found that there should be no correction for the people who were identified as white, but there should be for people who are identified as Hispanic, right? But this is going to be larger. So this problem of matching actually is going to affect the magnitude of the correction and sort of answers or helps get at a question about what should be used. And some of that depends on which purpose you're trying for. Same correction for contingencies. Looking at the way that decisions are made, psychologically, there's more room for the influence of stereotypes or biases where there's more discretion, which tends to be in decisions that are categorical, that tends to be right around the threshold. Stereotypes don't impact decisions much where everybody would agree because it's an obvious answer. And so when we look at the sentencing guidelines, that's kind of right around the threshold there for a year or more particularly when we actually look empirically at where most of the corrections were made, they were corrections that fell into these cells, which this one in particular is somebody with effectively no criminal record, but who commits a fairly serious crime. That question, reasonable people could differ about how to interpret that. And that seems to be where the problems are. So that means that we may want to focus our corrections on these kinds of situations and not apply the corrections on the margin to the extremes. The last one is kind of a legal question. We know right now the US Supreme Court is considering a case about whether or not race-based affirmative action can be used in higher education. This same principle applies to a lot of different areas of law, of the idea of under what circumstances should we take race, ethnicity, sex, these kind of protected categories into account in order to correct for problems. And current US legal jurisprudence basically says that this is allowable only when the past discrimination was purposeful, but not allowable if it happens to be a disparate impact of something where that wasn't the intent. Because to take somebody's race or ethnicity into account, even to make an adjustment, is purposeful discrimination in a sense. So the legality of how to use post hoc interventions and under these particular circumstances can be complex and maybe relate to the extent of evidence that this is actually some form of prejudice that's driving it, as opposed to some unaccounted for factor. In closing up here to leave some time for questions, I want to thank the Pufendorf Institute at Lund University who funded our work group, the Oregon Criminal Justice Commission who provided me with the data, the work group who you see pictured here actually in front of the Pufendorf Institute, and you for attending this session. Thank you very much.
That was great. Thank you so much. So we do have a question, but before we get to it, if it's okay, I wonder if you all would expand a little bit on that work group. I know that Martin referenced, that there are many different types of folks who are working in it. Certainly, he's from philosophy, you're from law and psychology. You're both very mathy, so I'm curious to know, how does the group, how did it come together? How do you assemble a diverse group like that? What do you look for? And how do you work together? Do you have to translate everything into a math kind of framework that everybody uses, or do you translate out from math so that the non-math types can participate?
Yeah, it's a good question. So it's sort of our work together evolved from what is called a Pufendorf theme, which is sort of a research incubator at Lund University. So it's essentially you apply for working at the institute for a year, and it's sort of directly trying to facilitate interdisciplinary work. So sort of a base group that worked there, which included Erik and myself, wasn't very mathy. We had a computer scientist as well and a statistician. We also had two lawyers, a social psychologist, a practical philosopher, two practical philosophers actually. And when we're now applying for sort of a larger grant to continue the research, we have during the last attempt we had 17 people, and most of them were not sort of from that sort of mathy form of working within that. So it's rather other way around. You can sort of, if you have the formal tools to modeling something in statistics or in some other language, you can sort of present and discuss problems within that framework, but the problems are sort of much more general, and you need a lot of psychological expertise and legal expertise for these kinds of questions to get any good answers.
The only thing I'll add to that, I guess two things I'll add to that. One is Martin's being a bit humble because I think he assembled the people and was very instrumental in that. And in addition to their expertise, I think he did a wonderful job of finding people who had some experience explaining disciplinary concepts in a way that wasn't jargon heavy or could translate it across, and also facilitating meetings. We met regularly over the course of the year, in which the norms of conversation were that it's okay to ask any question. Like, I don't understand that, can you re-explain it? And it wasn't viewed as, so someone must not be knowledgeable or whatever, but it was actually expected as part of the discourse. And I think both finding people who were amenable to that and creating a platform for that ended up being very generative. And at least I ended up learning a lot.
No, but I think, that was also very important. And I think that it's important that people are genuinely interested in sort of approaching things from different perspectives. So people who are very entrenched in the methods of their particular disciplines might work worse together with others from different disciplines.
Well, that's fascinating. It's interesting. It's so interesting to me how the model, it has so much explanatory power, and then it's almost instantly you think to yourself, but it's like then it can't be used in the way that it's a limited kind of powerful snapshot of the problem. Because when I was trying to imagine how you would approach a judge with this kind of data, it seems like a pretty thorny issue. Anyway, here's the question that we have. And anybody who'd like to enter a question, please feel free to enter a question. It says, I'll read this in case people can't see it. Super interesting. I wonder what thoughts you have about the fact that in some cases, there's an evaluator in the sense that it's Bob, the hiring guy. So we could measure what Bob does and kick in the corrective measures as appropriate. In other cases, it's not Bob, it's an organization, a school or a system like the courts, membership in which shifts, and one might even expect to see variation over time. How do you think about that?
So I think Erik's case is such a situation because there are multiple judges that make up the data that he's investigating. So there's no single person that you can sort of track their particular performance for. And I think that the best way to approach it, so we have an application to the Swedish Research Council, which rates grant proposals, and it's sort of a considerable part of research funding in Sweden. And for different disciplines, there are different groups, and these groups sort of change people over time, so on. So I think what you need to do is sort of just check to what degree there is variability and prejudice across those groups, or whether there's sufficient stability to think that this might actually improve things rather than worsening them, which that might in itself require sort of more data in order for this to be applicable. But in some cases, I think that's necessary.
I think one thing that I'll add is that kind of back to the cure not being worse than the disease portion, or turning a bit on how strong is the evidence or convincing is the evidence that this came from some kind of a prejudice from individuals, as opposed to some system feature that's otherwise legitimate but somehow wasn't captured. And I think people are more amenable to the evidence of the bias if it is one decision maker. If Bob, but not the three other people, are rating people in a different way, they are more likely to say, something about Bob, or Mike, is Martin's example, right? That piece. Whereas at a system level, people think, well, shouldn't the variation between Bob, Mike, Susan, Cleo, whomever, since they surely aren't all biased against women, shouldn't that wash out, or couldn't we somehow do comparisons that way? And so might something else be going on? Psychologically, I don't know that, I mean, to some extent that's going to be true. Everybody's stereotypes are not the same, certainly. It's also true that stereotypes are fairly socially shared. So there's a lot of work that while there is individual variation, on average in a society, people have stereotypes that kind of head in one direction or another. So it's not, I don't think it's fatal to the idea that stereotypes themselves are causing them when you're averaging across people from very similar cultural or other backgrounds. And in that sense, I think it is one more step removed, but I think there's still an argument there.
Thank you. Okay, so we have another question. Thank you for that question. And here's a good one. So what work needs to be done to bridge the gap between the powerful data showing the impact of the disparity today to a practical way for the correction to be applied going forward? This feels like the question. This is the question.
So I'm not sure I
can start off with this one too.
Yeah.
I'm interpreting the question as, okay, so there's a fair amount of research showing out there showing that we do have disparities. And so if this is a plausible or even preferential in some, or feasible and preferential intervention that might actually work to mitigate some of the damage from those disparities in decision-making, when we can't use when there aren't other effective interventions, or until we develop others, or decision supports, or other things. So how do we get decision makers and institutions to actually adopt this kind of approach? And I may be misinterpreting it as kind of a practical question around that. And I think about it two levels. One, since I do a fair amount of intervention work, one of them is the technical piece. It's easy when doing interventions to kind of get out ahead of evidence of efficacy and nailing down the pieces, because rightly so, we get very interested, like we want to fix it. There's a problem and it's people's lives are being affected, so we want to fix it. And there are also ways in which getting out ahead of things is part of the getting out ahead of the research, is why we also have a lot of ineffective interventions out there. So some of it is kind of identifying systematically the methods piece, and maybe I'll kick that to Martin in a second for why these questions are actually critical about the conditions under which these can happen, so we can do a better job of identifying it. The other, and this was part of our working group on the psychology side, is working on what kind of backlash or pushback, what happens when you go tell a decision maker, hey, we're going to override your decision because you're biased. Or what happens if you're in a decision of or applying for a job and someone says, hey, as part of the situation that you're in, we're going to correct ratings. And somebody might find out that they would have gotten the job, except the rating was corrected against them, ostensibly on the basis of evidence of the bias of the decision maker, but then they're without a job. And so those questions are sort of psychological around the acceptability of the intervention and what conditions maybe People are more likely to maybe be in favor or willing to accept decision supports, but not overrides. And those two are also empirical questions, because if you do it wrong, you could just get a lot of backlash effects and not be able to implement things that might be useful. But those are kind of my thoughts on it, Martin.
Currently I think that sort of the resistance that interventions generally face and the potential for backlash effects are one of the most important things to investigate here, and sort of what we learn from that will also sort of influence preventive interventions. So sort of people who reject anonymization because they think that it's unnecessary complication or something like that. And I think some postdoc interventions share some of the problems with preventive structural interventions, for instance, and just trying to identify what factors makes people resist adopting interventions, even in the light when they know that this is going to lead to more accurate judgments or better hiring or and so on. And there's a lot of work being done on this, but I think that's sort of the important bridging research for just sort of getting these kinds of things to be implemented at all. And then there's work sort of just trying to widen the scope of applicability of these interventions. So I mentioned sort of the GEU application that uses sort of interval scale assessment. Erik talked about categorical decisions, but there might sort of be postdoc interventions that are applicable for ranking decisions, for instance, that might be applicable to a wider set of circumstances, and just trying to find models that work in different conditions, I think is an important way forward. And I think also individual interventions have, I think can be it can be sort of more systematically investigated under what conditions they are supposed to work as well, because mostly when individual interventions are criticized, they are criticized for having no effect or no lasting effect or so on. But I think it's sort of the approach of trying to identify conditions when something actually will work is sort of a good way to sort of trying to find good fits between interventions and situations where we need to intervene, and trying to identify such conditions for other kinds of interventions is also kind of important bridging research.
I'll add one last piece to that before we go, which is, sometimes when we think about this work, it's easy, at least on the science side, to critique the models for not being perfect or tight enough. And I have to, constantly remind myself and others when I have that sort of professional hat on, to think, actually, we just need to beat the status quo in terms of accuracy, which is itself not perfect. And so thinking about what kind of things might be incremental advances that we feel comfortable rolling out before the final thing is done.
Well, thank you for that. And thank you so much for this wonderful presentation. Thanks to everybody for coming. And I hope that everybody has a wonderful rest of their week. Thank you, Dr. Jönsson. Thank you, Professor Girvan, and have a great rest of your day, everyone.